The bar was too loud, the music thumping hard enough to rattle the empty shot glasses on the counter. Jessica never came here, at least, not as far as I knew. Yet, there she was, tucked into the dim corner of the hollow oak, sitting across from a man I didn't recognize. I wasn't supposed to be there either. My buddy Max had dragged me out last minute, claiming I needed a break from the grind of work and home life. As soon as we walked in, I noticed her, my wife of 8 years, leaning forward over the table, laughing at something he said, her hand grazing his wrist. Max was halfway through ordering us around when I grabbed his arm. "Hold on," I muttered, my eyes glued to the booth. "Richard, you good?" he asked, but I couldn't answer. I thought it was a mistake, some optical illusion caused by the dim light and haze of cigarette smoke. I walked closer, keeping my distance, pretending to be interested in the pool table near the back. It wasn't an illusion. It was her. Jessica was glowing in a way I hadn't seen in years, her lips painted crimson, her laughter easy and free. And the man across from her? He leaned back in his seat, confidence radiating from him, as though he owned the whole damn bar. I could have turned around, could have left her there and told myself I was imagining things. But I didn't. I stayed, watching as she leaned even closer to him, her hand now tracing patterns on the back of his. That's when it hit me, whatever she was telling him wasn't the story she told me about drinks with the girls. Max must have figured out something was wrong because he walked over, a beer in each hand. "Dude, he said, following my gaze. "What do I do?" I whispered, not taking my eyes off her. "You want the truth," he said. "You go over there, or you sit here and let it eat you alive." I didn't have time to think about it. Jessica was sliding out of the booth, her arm brushing against the stranger's as she laughed at something else he said. They headed for the door, and before I could stop myself, I followed them. When they stepped outside, I stayed far enough behind to avoid notice. The man held the door open for her, and they walked into the night, down a path that would shatter my life. That was the moment everything started to unravel, the moment I realized I didn't know my wife at all. The hollow oak had a side exit that led to the parking lot. As I stepped through it, the cold air hit me, but I barely noticed. Jessica and the man were walking toward the far end of the lot, where the streetlights didn't quite reach. I stayed back, my heart pounding with something more primal than anger, curiosity, maybe, or the need for clarity. The man unlocked his car, a sleek, black sedan. Jessica hesitated at the passenger door. She looked over her shoulder, scanning the lot, and for a second, I thought she'd spotted me. But no, her attention drifted back to him as he said something I couldn't hear. She laughed, this soft, genuine laugh I hadn't heard from her in years, and got in. They drove off, and I just stood there, my body frozen, my brain racing to connect dots that didn't quite align. Where were they going? Who was he? And what the hell was I supposed to do now? I walked back into the bar, unsure of anything except that I needed to sit down. Max was at the table, nursing one of the beers he'd brought over earlier. His face lit up with relief when he saw me. "Man, I thought you'd bailed." "I should've," I muttered, sinking into the chair. Max leaned in. "What happened? You follow her?" "Yeah. She got into some guy's car." I grabbed the beer and took a long swig, hoping it would dull the edge of whatever was tearing through my chest. It didn't. Max sat back, exhaling sharply. "Damn, Rich. That's... What are you gonna do?" "I don't know." And I didn't. But I knew I wasn't going to just let it slide. For the next hour, I pretended to care about the game on TV, all while replaying the scene in the parking lot over and over in my head. The way she looked at him. The way she laughed. The ease in her body language. It wasn't just friendly. It was intimate, and the realization hit me like a freight train. I had no idea what my wife was doing when she wasn't with me. When I finally got home, the house was dark except for the faint glow from our bedroom window. I let myself in quietly, half hoping she'd still be awake so I could confront her, half hoping she wasn't so I could avoid it altogether. She was in bed, her back to the door, the soft hum of her breathing filling the room. I stood there for a moment, watching her. She looked peaceful, like she hadn't just blown up my world. I couldn't sleep. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of her moving around in the kitchen. I stayed in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I could go downstairs and act like everything was normal. After about 10 minutes, I decided I couldn't. Instead, I waited until she left for work, then sat down at the dining table with a notepad and pen. I started listing every excuse Jessica had made in the past few months: nights out with friends, late work meetings, spontaneous errands that didn't quite make sense. The list grew longer than I expected, and with it, the gnawing suspicion that last night wasn't the first time she'd been with that guy. Then, I thought about her phone. It wasn't a habit of mine to invade her privacy, but after what I saw last night, I felt justified. I grabbed her spare key from the hook by the door and headed out. Jessica's office was about 15 minutes away, but I wasn't going there. I drove past it, keeping my distance, and waited until I saw her car leave the parking lot during lunch. I followed at a safe distance as she made her way to a small cafe downtown. She parked, got out, and walked inside without looking back. I stayed in the car, watching through the large cafe windows as she sat at a corner table. A few minutes later, he walked in, the same man from last night. I watched as they greeted each other like old lovers, her hand resting on his arm as they talked. She was animated, her gestures full of life in a way I hadn't seen in years. It was as if I didn't exist, as if our marriage was just a backdrop to whatever this was. I couldn't take it anymore. I got out of the car and walked into the cafe. They didn't notice me at first, too absorbed in their conversation. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my eyes locked on her. When she finally looked up, her face went pale. "Richard," she said, her voice trembling. The man turned to face me, his expression neutral, almost amused. "Who's this?" I asked, keeping my tone as even as I could. Jessica stammered, "It's not what you think." "Oh, it's exactly what I think," I cut her off, my gaze shifting between her and the man. "Why don't you enlighten me, Jessica? Who the hell is he?" The man extended his hand as if we were meeting at a cocktail party. "I'm Daniel." I ignored him. Jessica stood up, placing herself between us. "Richard, let's talk about this at home." "No," I said, my voice rising. "We'll talk about it right here, in front of your friend." People were starting to stare, but I didn't care. I was done playing the clueless husband. She grabbed my arm, trying to lead me outside. "Please, Richard, don't do this here." I yanked my arm free. "Do what? Call out your lies?" Daniel finally spoke up, his tone calm and condescending. "Maybe we should all take a breather." "Stay out of this," I snapped, my anger finally boiling over. Jessica's eyes filled with tears, but I didn't feel sorry for her. Not yet. We left the cafe, the silence between us suffocating. When we got home, she tried to explain, but her words felt empty, rehearsed. "It was just lunch," she said, over and over, as if that made it better. But I knew better. We barely made it through the front door before I let her have it. "Start talking," I said, slamming the door shut behind me. Jessica froze in the hallway, her coat still on, her bag dangling from her shoulder. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. For the first time since I'd met her, she looked like she had no idea what to say. "Don't just stand there," I snapped. "Explain yourself." "Richard, it's not what you think," she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Don't you dare insult my intelligence with that line," I said, stepping closer to her. I saw you with him last night, and I saw you today at lunch. So don't tell me it's nothing." She blinked rapidly, like she was trying to hold back tears. "We're just friends. That's all. You're blowing this way out of proportion." "Friends?" I repeated, laughing bitterly. Friends don't hold hands across the table. Friends don't laugh like they've got some private joke the rest of the world isn't in on. And friends sure as hell don't sneak around behind their husband's back. She flinched, but she still wouldn't meet my eyes. "I didn't sneak around. I told you I was going out with the girls last night." I pointed a finger at her, my voice rising. "Lying by omission is still lying, Jessica. Don't twist this into something it's not. I didn't lie, she shot back, her voice breaking for the first time. I went out, and yes, I ran into Daniel. But we didn't plan it. I could feel my blood boiling. Bullshit. Do you think I'm stupid? I followed you today, Jessica. I saw you meet him at that cafe. How do you explain that? She hesitated, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. We've been talking. That's all. I swear. Talking, I said flatly, my anger giving way to cold disbelief. About what? How to destroy our marriage. Her face crumpled, and for a moment, I thought she might actually tell me the truth. But then she straightened up, her expression hardening. I don't have to explain myself to you. You're acting like a maniac right now. Her defiance only fueled my rage. You don't have to explain yourself? I shouted. You're my wife. You damn well owe me an explanation. She turned away from me, shrugging off her coat and tossing it onto the couch. I'm not doing this with you, Richard. Not when you're like this. I grabbed her arm, forcing her to face me. You don't get to walk away from this conversation. Not this time. Let go of me, she yelled, yanking her arm free. For a moment, we just stood there, staring at each other. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of our heavy breathing. Then, she folded her arms across her chest and said, Fine. You want the truth? Daniel is a coworker. We've been working on a project together, and we got close. But it's not what you think. It's not an affair. You expect me to believe that? I asked, my voice dripping with sarcasm. You've been lying to me for God knows how long, and now I'm just supposed to take your word for it? I haven't lied, she insisted, her voice rising again. I didn't tell you because I knew you'd react like this. React like what? I snapped. Like a man whose wife has been sneaking around with another man? Yeah, Jessica, I think that's a pretty normal reaction. Her eyes filled with tears, but I didn't care. I was too angry, too hurt to feel any sympathy. It's not an affair, she said again, her voice trembling. I swear to you, Richard. I love you. I laughed bitterly. Love me? If this is your idea of love, I'd hate to see what hate looks like. She shook her head, tears streaming down her face now. I made a mistake. I let things get too familiar with Daniel, but I never crossed the line. I never betrayed you. Too familiar? I repeated. You let some guy get close enough that you're meeting him outside of work, and you don't think that's a betrayal? It's not like that, she yelled. Then what the hell is it, Jessica? I roared. Because from where I'm standing, it looks exactly like that. She threw up her hands in frustration. I don't know, okay? I don't know how to explain it. Her admission was like a punch to the gut. For a moment, I couldn't speak, couldn't even think. You don't know, I said finally, my voice low and dangerous. You don't know why you've been lying to me, sneaking around behind my back? That's the best you can come up with? She covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking as she sobbed. But her tears didn't move me. If anything, they made me angrier. Save the tears, Jessica, I said coldly. They don't mean anything to me right now. She dropped her hands, her face red and blotchy. What do you want from me, Richard? Do you want me to say I'm sorry? Fine. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for whatever you think I've done. Whatever I think you've done? I repeated, my voice rising again. Don't play dumb, Jessica. I know exactly what you've done. She shook her head, her expression one of despair. I don't know how we got here. I don't know how to fix this. I took a step back, the weight of her words sinking in. She didn't know how we got here. She didn't know how to fix this. And for the first time, I realized she might not want to. That's the problem, isn't it? I said quietly. You don't care enough to fix this. You don't care about me, about us. Her face crumpled again, but I didn't stick around to watch her cry. I turned and walked out of the room, slamming the door behind me. Upstairs, I sat on the edge of our bed, my head in my hands. I'd wanted the truth, but now that I had it, or at least some version of it, I didn't know what to do with it. Jessica wasn't the woman I thought she was. And I wasn't sure I could ever forgive her for that. Jessica was in the shower when it happened. I don't even remember consciously deciding to do it, my body moved on autopilot. Her phone was sitting on the nightstand, the screen lighting up briefly as another notification rolled in. I'd noticed her entering her PIN a few times before, purely by accident, just a quick glance as she swiped. I hadn't thought much of it at the time. But now, with the faint sound of the water running in the background, I had the perfect opportunity. I picked up the phone, my hand steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. 4 digits. Easy. The lock screen vanished, replaced by her home screen, an array of apps that seemed completely innocuous at first glance. But I knew where to start. Her messages. The first thing that caught my eye was a thread with someone saved as Tom. I opened it, and immediately, my stomach dropped. The tone of the messages wasn't just flirtatious, it was explicit. Detailed descriptions of what they wanted to do to each other. And then, the photos. There were dozens of them, each more graphic than the last. Some of Jessica, some of him. The kind of pictures that left no room for doubt about their relationship. But Tom wasn't the only one. There was another thread with a man named Jake filled with the same kind of sickeningly intimate messages and photos. Then another, and another. Jessica wasn't just having an affair, she was juggling multiple men. I backed out of her texts and started scanning her apps. That's when I saw it, a group chat in an app one didn't recognize. The name of the chat was No Strings Fun, and it only took a few seconds of scrolling to figure out what it was, a hookup group. Jessica was actively chatting with strangers, discussing meetups, sharing suggestive pictures, and talking about her preferences. I couldn't breathe. My hand shook as I scrolled through the filth she'd been hiding right under my nose. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't just getting too close to a coworker or a one-time slip. This was calculated, repeated, and vile. The shower stopped. My heart leapt into my throat as I quickly locked the phone and placed it back on the nightstand, exactly where it had been. Jessica stepped out of the bathroom a moment later, wrapped in a towel, her wet hair dripping onto her shoulders. "Hey," she said casually, grabbing her robe. I forced a neutral expression. "Hey." She didn't seem to notice anything out of the ordinary as she went about her routine. But inside, I was a storm of emotions: rage, disgust, heartbreak. I didn't say anything. Not yet. I didn't confront Jessica that night. I couldn't. Not because I was afraid, but because I needed time to process what I'd seen. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the images and messages burned into my brain. Jessica slept soundly beside me, completely oblivious to the fact that the life we'd built was crumbling under the weight of her deceit. By morning, I had a plan. Jessica was sipping her coffee at the kitchen table when I walked in, still in her robe. "Morning," she said, her tone casual, as if she hadn't turned our marriage into a playground for her sick games. "Morning," I replied, grabbing a cup of coffee and sitting across from her. My tone was calm, but my mind was racing. I studied her for a moment, wondering how many times she'd looked me in the eye and lied. Wondering how long she'd been doing this, and whether there'd ever been a moment of genuine remorse. "What are you up to today?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. "Just some errands," she said. "Might meet up with Sarah later for lunch." Another lie. "That's nice," I said, nodding. "You know, we should talk later. About us." Her brow furrowed slightly, but she kept her composure. "What do you mean?" "Just some things I've been thinking about. I'll let you know when I get back." With that, I grabbed my keys and left the house. I didn't go to work. Instead, I drove to a small cafe downtown and set up shop in a quiet corner. I opened my laptop and began transferring everything I'd found on Jessica's phone to a secure folder, screenshots of messages, photos, and evidence from the group chats. Every piece of filth I could gather, I documented it. By the time I finished, I had enough to destroy her reputation, her relationships, and any chance she thought she had of coming out of this unscathed. When I returned home that evening, Jessica was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone. She looked up as I walked in, her expression guarded. "You said you wanted to talk," she asked. "Yeah," I said, taking a seat in the armchair across from her. "We need to have an honest conversation, Jessica." Her smile faltered. "Okay." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. "I want you to tell me the truth. About everything. No more excuses, no more lies." She blinked, her expression shifting from confusion to defensiveness. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the men," I said bluntly. "I'm talking about Tom, Jake, and God knows who else. I'm talking about the group chat you're in, where you hook up with strangers." Her face went pale. What are you saying?" "Don't play dumb, Jessica," I said, my voice cold. "I saw your phone. I saw the messages, the pictures, all of it. So, here's your chance. Tell me the truth, or I'll lay it all out for you." Her eyes filled with tears, but I didn't let it move me. "Richard, it's not what it looks like." "Don't," I interrupted sharply. "Don't insult me with that line. Just be honest for once in your life." She stared at me, her hands trembling. I don't know what to say." "How about the truth?" I snapped. "How long has this been going on? Weeks? Months? Years?" She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "It wasn't supposed to mean anything. It was just a distraction." "A distraction?" I repeated, incredulous. "From what? From your marriage? From your responsibilities? From the life we built together?" Her sobs grew louder, but I didn't care. She'd made her choices, and now she had to face the consequences. "Why, Jessica?" I demanded. "Why did you do it?" "I don't know," she cried. "I don't know, Richard. I was bored, okay? I felt trapped." "Trapped?" I said, my voice dripping with disbelief. "You felt trapped in a marriage where you had everything? A husband who loved you? A stable life? And your solution was to screw around with strangers?" She covered her face with her hands, unable to look at me. "I trusted you," I said, my voice cold and steady. "I gave you everything, and you threw it all away for what? A cheap thrill?" "I didn't mean for it to get this far," she said, her voice muffled. "I never wanted to hurt you." "Well, congratulations," I said bitterly. "You succeeded." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The only sound was her muffled sobbing. Finally, she looked up at me, her eyes red and swollen. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I leaned back in my chair, studying her. "That depends," I said. "Are you willing to walk away with nothing? Because that's what's going to happen if this goes public." Her face crumpled. "Richard, please, don't do this." "Don't do what?" I said, my tone icy. "Don't make you face the consequences of your actions? Don't hold you accountable for the pain you've caused?" "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'll do anything to fix this. Please, just give me a chance." I stared at her, wondering if she even understood the gravity of what she'd done. "You want a chance?" I said finally. "Prove it. Pack your things and leave tonight. I'll think about whether or not you deserve another conversation after that." She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Okay," she said softly. "I'll go." I stood up, my heart heavy but resolute. "Good. And Jessica? Don't think for a second that I'm letting this go. We're done, but I'm not finished. She didn't say anything as I walked out of the room, leaving her to pack her things and face the reality of her choices. Jessica left that night. I watched her carry her suitcases out to her car without offering to help. Every step she took felt like a chapter closing, though the book was far from finished. She paused before getting in the car, looking back at me with tears in her eyes, as if hoping I'd stop her. I didn't. I stood in the doorway until her taillights disappeared, then closed the door and locked it behind me. For the first time in years, the house felt quiet, too quiet. But it was mine again, and that was a start. The next few days were a whirlwind of action. I met with Laura, my lawyer, and laid out everything I had. She was impressed by how thorough I'd been, but her advice was blunt. "We can make sure this goes your way," she said, tapping the folder of evidence. "But be prepared. She's going to fight. Affairs don't always mean she loses everything." "She'll lose enough," I replied. The process of filing for divorce was cold and clinical, a far cry from the emotional storm raging inside me. But I followed Laura's advice, focusing on securing my financial stability and ensuring Jessica wouldn't get more than she deserved, which, in my opinion, was nothing. Jessica called a few times during that week, but I didn't answer. Her voicemails were a mix of apologies, pleas, and anger. "You're blowing this out of proportion," she said in one. "I made a mistake, but it doesn't have to end like this." She didn't get it. It wasn't just a mistake, it was a betrayal, one she chose to repeat over and over again. By the end of the week, I was ready for the next step, confronting Daniel. Not for revenge, but for clarity. I needed to hear from him how deep this went, how much of my life had been a lie. Finding him wasn't hard. I knew where Jessica had said he worked, and a quick online search confirmed it. I waited outside his office building during lunch hour, watching as people streamed out onto the street. When he finally appeared, laughing with a coworker, my blood boiled. I stepped in front of him, blocking his path. "Daniel," I said. He stopped, his smile fading as he looked at me. "Do I know you?" "You do," I said coldly. "I'm Jessica's husband." His face went pale, and his coworker quickly excused herself. "Can we talk?" I asked, though it wasn't really a question. He nodded, and we walked to a nearby park, sitting on a bench away from the crowds. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I could see him squirming, trying to decide whether to play dumb or come clean. "I know about you and Jessica," I said finally. "I've seen the messages, the photos. So don't bother denying it." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Look, man, I didn't mean for things to get out of hand." "Out of hand?" I repeated, my voice rising. "You were screwing my wife. How the hell do you think that was going to end?" He flinched but didn't argue. "It wasn't serious," he said. It was just something that happened." "Something that happened," I said, shaking my head. "You don't even have the balls to take responsibility, do you?" "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I know that doesn't mean much, but I am." I stared at him, wondering what Jessica had seen in this pathetic excuse for a man. He wasn't worth ruining a marriage over, but then again, neither was she. "I don't need your apology," I said, standing up. "I just wanted you to know that I know. And if I ever see you near her or me again, you'll regret it." He nodded, his eyes fixed on the ground. "Understood." The divorce proceedings were underway, and I was determined to come out of it stronger. I threw myself into work, picking up extra projects to fill the hours that used to be spent with Jessica. But it wasn't just about keeping busy. I started going to the gym again, reconnecting with old friends, and even looking into therapy to help process everything I'd been through. It wasn't easy, but each step forward felt like a victory. Jessica, on the other hand, wasn't doing so well. Word of her affairs had started to spread, thanks in part to mutual friends who noticed her sudden absence and asked questions. She called me once, begging me to stop ruining her life. "You did that on your own," I said before hanging up. The day our divorce was finalized, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief, sadness, anger, it all swirled together as I signed the papers. Jessica wasn't in the room, which made it easier, but I couldn't stop thinking about how it had all come to this. Later that evening, I sat on the couch with a glass of whiskey, reflecting on everything that had happened. I thought about the life Jessica and I had built, the good times we'd shared, and how quickly it had all fallen apart.